I was terrified all the time, Ollie, to be honest. I think it's sort of all these orders and shouting and you must do this. You were scared to do anything wrong. And I think that's what terrified me, really. I didn't want to do anything wrong. Because if I did, I didn't know what would happen.
That's my grandma, Jill Chubb. She was one of the Guernsey Deportees, a group of islanders sent away to Biberach internment camp during the Second World War. Imprisoned and in squalor, it was in these barracks, surrounded by barbed wire, that she, along with the other deportees, spent 3 long years of her life. Just a handful of those who lived through this life-altering experience are still alive today, and this podcast is dedicated to preserving their memories.
Everybody suffered in the war, and I think it's about time that they knew our story and what we suffered in the camps.
I'm Ollie Guillou. I first interviewed my grandma about the deportation during my time as a journalist at BBC Radio Guernsey. Since then, I've always wanted to dig deeper into her story, to understand the true extent of what she and her fellow islanders went through. And now, more than ever, it's clear time is running out. Even since beginning conversations to get this podcast in motion, a number of Guernsey deportees have sadly died. So that's why the time is now to tell their tale. Now, if you're unfamiliar with Guernsey, it's a gorgeous little island nestled between France and the south of England, sitting next to Jersey in the English Channel. It's part of the British Isles, but has its own government, and it's a beautiful holiday destination.
You think of Guernsey, you think of tomatoes, of course, and you think of the greenhouses that were here. An idyllic life, yes, but it was tough for some people.
That's Guernsey-based historian Matt Lucas. The First and Second World Wars have been a passion, obsession of his for more than 40 years.
These things we tend to look through with very sentimental eyes, but it was at times tough, but generally very pleasant, a big sense of belonging, a big sense of community, a big sense of things not changed or have not changed for generations. The old traditions are still very much carrying on as they had done for hundreds of years, with certain things changing, but generally not a huge amount. The impact of the First World War, of course, was still acutely felt.
And while, as Matt explains, life in the islands was difficult at times, the worst was yet to come. On the 1st of September 1939, World War II began, a war that would leave a lasting impact on the Channel Islands.
When war breaks out, it's similar in a lot of respects to the mainland. Air raid precautions, the air raid wardens would be out, thinking of air raid shelters, military installations. There was obviously quite a few all over the island, and it did all over the islands. And that built up expecting a war maybe similar to the First World War. And then, of course, May 1940, once the Germans attack really through the Low Countries, the Netherlands and Belgium, and into France, then you get a difference there between here and the UK, because you start obviously getting evacuees coming from France ahead of that German invasion that are starting to tell stories of what's happening. You hear these stories back in the UK, but you're actually speaking to people that, were on the receiving end of the German blitzkrieg. So there is a sense of worry, a sense of something is coming and it's not going to be nice. But they're not going to imagine that what happens actually happens.
After the fall of France in 1940, the British government decided the Channel Islands were indefensible and demilitarised them. This left the islands vulnerable, and in June 1940, German forces started to occupy them.
Civilian population is kept away from certain areas. Curfews I've mentioned, but obviously you can't go walking around some of the camps. You can't just go walking around the German defences and the defences you see on the coast. Of course not. You can get about quite a few places, but are you going to have your own vehicles? No, the Germans have commandeered those. you see a difference with the defences, that the fortress or Festung Guernsey starts to be created, and then you see a change in the population. You have a lot of forced labourers, paid labourers, slave workers. It's a big mixture of different people that will come to the islands. Well, obviously they fortify the coast, they're building batteries inland, they're making those temporary defences permanent.
By 1942, the war had been raging for 3 long years, and Guernsey had been under German occupation for 2 of them. Then came the devastating news, an order for deportation. Adolf Hitler had issued the order in retaliation for the Allies' internment of German civilians. It was also a tactic to increase leverage in prisoner exchanges and bolster the war effort by using civilian labour. The order targeted specific groups: British citizens who had moved to Guernsey from the mainland, Jewish people, and anyone the Germans deemed a threat to their war effort.
Hitler decided that for every German prisoner, he would take 10 English men from the Channel Islands for every one German. So because my father was born in England, he's about 6 months when he came here with my gran in the First World War, he was still English. So that's why we had to go. It was a reprisal for something they'd done. And he said, OK, you take people from here.
But what exactly was it about being British that made you a target? Standing in his room adorned with World War II memorabilia, Matt told me it all begins with an event that happened thousands of miles away from this small island community.
In Iran, of all places. The British and the Russians have an agreement, and they want to remove the Germans that are in Iran. Iran is a neutral country and has been working with Germany as a neutral country. It's perfectly entitled to, for goods and all sorts of commercial things. So there's quite a few Germans living in Iran. A number of them are military age. Iran's next to Iraq. The British control Iraq. There's been an insurrection earlier in 1941, and that the British put down, and that has been backed by the Germans and the Italians to a lesser degree. And on the other side, of course, you have Soviet Russia. Iran is a bit of a potential problem. The British have approached the Iranian government, the Iranian authorities, Persia, of course, as it is at the time. They were very reluctant to start with, but eventually they agree. And these Germans are deported mainly, in the end, to Australia. So they're out of the picture. It's a bit of a, we can breathe now, Britain and Russia. That problem of Iran, a potential problem, has gone. Adolf is not a fan of this. Obviously, he is very annoyed. How dare the Allies interfere with a neutral country? That's something obviously Hitler wouldn't have done. So how can he get back at the Allies? Right, we need to do exactly the same. But the only part of the British Isles that the Germans controlled is, of course, the Channel Islands. But actually, there's no free movement in the Channel Islands for the civilian population. They're interned anyway. So what can they do? There is a loophole. They can actually get the British, the people in Guernsey and Jersey, that were not born in the Channel Islands, actually born in the UK, and those that were caught up by the movement of war, 1939, 1940, that their permanent address wasn't in the Channel Islands, they could deport these. Hitler wishes to have 10 British people deported for every German that was deported from Persia. This is not practical. And the whole thing takes quite a while to actually be implemented. But 1942, it is started. There are over 2,000 people from the Channel Islands deported, and well over 1,000 from Guernsey and Sark. Most of those end up eventually in Biberach. There's a number of other camps. So the initial deportations, really, 1942.
The deportation order tore families apart and people were given very little notice. My grandma was just 3 years old when her family was told they'd be leaving.
My name is Jill Chubb. My maiden name is Wild, Jill Wild. I was born on 1939 in September the 16th. I was a week into my 3rd year before we went to Germany. That was in 1942. The first thing I really remember, my mum told me we were going on holiday, so I packed my little bag and we went down to the Gaumont cinema. I didn't realise it was a cinema, I knew it was something, but we came home again. I was really disappointed. I thought we were going on holiday. Anyway, we did, eventually, but it was to Germany. It was about September the 23rd when we set sail.
At this young age, Grandma, she wasn't very tall. She had curly blonde hair. It grew darker over time though as she got older, much to the dismay of the Germans. She was thin but had strong little legs and she could run fast. Her father used to make her rope sandals, but she was never that keen on them. She wasn't used to wearing shoes and socks, something that hasn't changed much even now. Now, despite that initial failed attempt to leave the island, her family was finally deported on the 23rd of September, 1942.
The reason why they couldn't go, first of all, because there was a storm and there were U-boats around, they had to be careful. We got aboard a cargo ship, and I remember going down into the hold. There's straw bales and paraffin lanterns, very smelly. And then they closed the top doors on us. They were sitting in the hold, basically. And I was a bit scared. My dad said, there's nothing to be worried about. And my mother had my brother.
Ralph Godwin is one of the Guernsey Deportees, and he was a very similar age to my grandma when he was sent away on that cargo ship.
I'm Ralph Godwin, and I'm 86. And I have a twin brother who grew up with me, is no longer with us, unfortunately. So I'm carrying his memories as mine as well. But we're similarly inclined to see the same side of things. And in that way, as men do, we tend to look at the rough and tumble side of life rather than the sweet side of life. I can remember that we did start to go one day and we went down to the White Rock and then we were told to go back because there's something wrong with the boat. The next day we went down and we went and got on this boat. It was quite a rough day and my parents were neither of them very good sailors. We two boys eventually ended up on the top of the boat with a man, and I can't remember his name, who used to own the Fermain Tavern, or run the Fermain Tavern, because I had, since the war, talked to him about it. And he said, I looked after you two boys, your parents weren't any good, so when you sailed into St. Malo, he said, they appeared again. We got on the train from St. Malo. It took 2 days to get to the Rhine. We stopped overnight somewhere south of Paris first time, and the next night we were on the banks of the Rhine at Cologne. I have looked at my mother's diaries one day, and she made the comment that what a lovely train journey it was. But whether that was her sense of humour, I don't know.
So I guess some of the memories that you have from early on where perhaps you wouldn't ordinarily remember things like that. It's a bit of you and your brother kind of piecing together pieces of a puzzle.
But yes, and also geographically, I've always been interested in what's going on outside the window and what part of the country we're in. Never having been to France, so that, of course, at that age, it was very intriguing and interesting. So the train journey went, but it certainly lasted 2 days before we got to the Rhine. And then we moved across the Rhine and went up to Dorsten, which is northeast of the crossing of the Rhine, just the other side of Düsseldorf.
We'll come back to Dorsten in another episode. It's an important part of this journey to Biberach. But for now, I'd like to share with you a lasting memory of the beginning of this trip, something my grandma showed me, her parents' identity cards.
They all had identity cards.
These are little yellow one-page booklets with identity card written on the front with the German underneath. Inside are pictures of her father and mother, wonderfully preserved mementos that took my breath away.
This is your great-grandmother. That's Molly. That's my mum. I think she's about 24. Somebody gave her this saying up here before she went.
Yeah, it looks like it says,
Yeah.
when thou passes through the water,
Yeah.
I will be with thee.
Yeah.
Isaiah.
Yeah. So they gave that to Mum before she went away. And this is my dad, Ollie's great-granddad. And John.
I've never seen a picture of him before.
No. Good looking, eh? Just like you, darling. Can I say that? Yeah. Yeah, and that's my dad. Here you
That's
are.
amazing.
He had blue eyes and black hair. And this is a stamp in German they stamp the cards with. It's nice to show you that because they deserve to be honoured. Really pleased.
Every one of the civilians were issued one of these before they went to Germany. But my question is, why was this even allowed to happen? I mean, why did the UK agree to Hitler's terms and allow for those people to be taken prisoner from Guernsey?
There wasn't really a lot that the British could do. Although, it's people have been deported before, but for specific crimes, inverted commas, acts of resistance, etc., which was quite a normal thing to do in wartime. But there was very little the British could do. You could protest, but you can't attack the islands, you can't attack the shipping. The British do attack shipping, of course, but that's on a military level, that's very different. And certainly the locals, if we look at the local government, was obviously against it, but there was very little that they could do. They're totally outnumbered by the Germans. Interesting, the German military is not in favour of this at all. And when you speak to people that were deported, that were of an age to remember it, they will tell you that the German soldiers are quite upset with this. And I can remember some of the people that were deported saying to me that Germans actually came up to them and said, "We are sorry about this.
Why?
This is not what we wanted to do." They felt that the British and Germans should get on. This is not the way to treat the civilian population here. This is a model occupation. People getting on, generally speaking. As my friend said, no real Nazis here. So having 2,000 people deported was not on.
It was just a statement piece. It was to prove that he could retaliate because, like you said, they were interned anyway.
Yes, I mean, they're interned anyway. The civilian population, it was this little loophole. Hitler's island madness, the Channel Islands are fortified beyond all military sense. It's the only part of Britain that the Germans have, British Isles, that the Germans are in possession of. And certainly controlling that part of the civilian population, it's symbolic. It's Hitler having his little bit of revenge.
Now, we've heard Matt say a few figures regarding the number of people who were deported. 2,000 across the islands, about 1,200 from Guernsey. But we don't actually have an exact number of how many people were sent away.
It's never been exact to the nearest person because there were few people committed suicide before they went. There were a few people who didn't turn up for the boats. There were a few people who had last-minute exemptions. And so there's never been an absolute figure. You can actually say this is 1,124 people were deported throughout the Channel Islands. No, you can't say that.
That's my grandpa, Alan Chubb, who's shared in my grandma's journey for a long time and is in fact the secretary of the Guernsey Deportees Association. Now, it's quite horrifying to know that some people thought there was no alternative other than to end their own lives rather than be deported. But while we knew the war ended and the Allies won, people at that time didn't. And the thought of what might happen to them if the Germans won, well. For Janet Dos Santos, her deportation story is quite different for a variety of reasons. Firstly, she was much younger when she was deported, so much of what she knows are the things that she was told by her parents. But also, the journey that led Janet and her family to leave the island was all the more complex.
My mother was Jewish, so that rather complicated things a little. It was only my mother and myself who were supposed to go, but my father insisted on coming with us. My father was a locally born person, but didn't need to go, but came. Unfortunately, we were split up originally. We didn't go to Biberach to begin with. My mother and I went to Compiègne in France, which was a transit camp where mostly people were sent prior to going to extermination camps. And my father was sent to a place called Laufen, which was where British men were. It was a camp for men only. I obviously don't remember anything about it, but for my mother, I should imagine being an Austrian Jew, it must have been pretty awful. I mean, I've been there myself. I visited it, and it was within walking distance of the railway station. It was a place where a lot of the French who had been in the resistance movement, if they were kind of arrested, they were put there, and then they were walked down to the railway station and then sent to extermination camps. So the road between the camp and the railway station is marked by footprints on the road as something to remind people of what happened there. But eventually we were kind of sent on to Biberach and reunited with my father.
So was the intention that she was to be sent on to an extermination camp?
She had kind of left Vienna with two friends when the Germans had invaded Vienna. Well, in fact, just before they invaded, I presume. And they had somehow come over to Guernsey, these three women, and they got themselves jobs with Guernsey families as kind of housekeepers. And my mother was in a house in Cobo in Guernsey and met my father, and they got married, and I was the result.
Fortunately for Janet and her mother, either the British or Guernsey authorities managed to get them transferred to Biberach rather than an extermination camp, because her mother was British by marriage, but her mother's friends were sadly not as fortunate. Now, at this point, you may be wondering, how on earth does anyone remember what happened to them at the age of 3? Well, I put this question to Grandma.
Because it made such an impact on my life, probably. That's the only thing I can put it down to. But I've still got a good memory. And still inquisitive, want to know bits and pieces of what's happening now. So as a child, I can imagine that, that's me. I just can remember. I mean, some people went there and can't remember a thing. And I can't understand it. But that's my makeup.
And it makes sense. The brain makes connections more strongly under certain conditions, like trauma, for instance. And her ability to recall these memories was really demonstrated when, decades later, she revisited Biberach with my grandpa. But that's a story for another episode. First, I want to tackle Dawston. You'll have heard that name come up a few times. Dawston was an internment camp that the deportees spent time at on their way to Biberach. And by all accounts, it was a terrible, nasty place. In the next episode, we'll be finding out all about it and the arduous journey to Biberach.
We're hungry. It's so dark all the time. It's unbearable. I'll never forget it, and I'll never go back to Dawston. I'd sooner cut my throat.